welcome back to the lab section as we are going to discuss how to understand your laboratory reports. Now, you might say, well, I don't ever get my laboratory reports. But I'm going to encourage you to ask your physician if you might have copies of your laboratory test results. They're yours. You paid for them. And just tell them kindly that you just keep a personal folder on your medical studies and you'd like to have copies of all your labs. And at first it may seem a little strange because not many patients do that and they're just told by their physician, well, everything looks good. And just be as kind as you can and just say, well, I appreciate that, but I would just like my own copies. And again, that quotation for drugs never cure disease, Ministry of Healing, page 126. Okay? Let's pray and then we'll begin. Oh, Father, you've shared so much with us already. And truly, we can just see how you account us as friends. For you share with us the very secrets of heaven. And we're very grateful for this honor, this privilege of being called sons and daughters of the Most High God. And we are now inviting you once again to be in our midst, that your presence is sensed, that the holiness of the time is perceived, and that you would be once again our instructor. For Jesus' sake, amen. If you have your lab copies, we're going to go to the first page where we will find in the upper left-hand corner a panel which is referred to as the lipid panel. Lipids, another term for that, are your blood fats. There are two types. There is cholesterol, and then there is the triglyceride component. Both are probably very much involved in risk for coronary artery disease. The higher the fat content of the blood, the more likely we are to develop those coronary artery blockages and atherosclerosis involving the other arteries. But you'll see in the column under in range, out of range, will be the person's laboratory values. Over on the right-hand side of the sheet is referred as a reference range. Now that's what the laboratory reports as the norm. So if you're lower than the norm, you'll be printed as an out-of-range value, or if you're higher than the norm, you'll be printed out of range. If you fall within that reference range number, they will print your values in the in-range column. Now that doesn't mean that because you're in range that it always is the healthiest. It's just that's what the lab uses as some standard of reference. Now, unless they have changed, the way we used to get these ranges of normal values is we would take a population that we would study and we would think they looked pretty healthy. And then we would sample their blood and we would get an average on whatever value it was. If we're measuring cholesterol, we would take, what the mean cholesterol was for all of those people in that sample cohort. And then we would do some statistical analysis of that, and I don't want to get into all that today. It's mathematical calculations, doing standard deviation curves, and we would take a standard deviation above and a standard deviation below the mean, and that would be the display of numbers. That just means that there are going to be some people that are fairly healthy that are less than the average, and some that are pretty healthy that are above the average. And how far above is what we call a standard deviation. Now, within that standard deviation above and below the mean, you still are going to have about 5% of your people that are going to fall outside of the reference range, either 5% be below or above the average. Okay? Is that understood? Fairly clear? All right. Now, let's look at the triglycerides. Normal is less than 150, and you can see this person happens to fall within that range. If you inherit certain genes for the production of fats, these values may run higher than the normal, or if you're taking in an excess of certain fats, or for triglycerides, too many calories, too many simple sugars, your triglyceride levels will be high. If you tend to be overweight, you're taking in too many calories in your diet, especially calories that are coming from sugar and sweet foods and so forth. Those will be converted over to triglycerides, and your triglyceride levels will be elevated. Now, the cholesterol comes from usually the ingestion of animal fats, or if your liver is making more cholesterol, if you've inherited a gene pool for cholesterol synthesis that's higher than normal. Now, you'll notice the range here, 125 to 200 for total cholesterol. That seems to me to be a little high. I wouldn't want my cholesterol to be 200. Now, some, if you've inherited a gene pool and you're on a complete plant-based diet, that's the best you can do, well, that's where you are. But if you can bring this cholesterol down to the lowest level possible by changing diet and lifestyle, you're much better off. In the Framingham studies, which were done back, I think, in the early 1900s, I believe. I don't say so early, but say, when was it? Yeah, exactly, in the 40s or something like that. What they found was, in sampling populations, that people were very, very unlikely to have any coronary artery disease as manifested by a heart attack if their cholesterol levels were less than 150. All right? And you've heard the old adage, you take your age and you add 100 to it, and that's where your cholesterol ought to be. Well, you can use that as a general rule, but there are going to be people that don't follow that rule, okay? But just know that within that therapeutic, reference range, the lower you can get your cholesterol within reason, the healthier you will be, the less likely you will be to have coronary artery disease and atherosclerosis. LDL levels and HDL levels are also given in reference, and these are changing. You see here less than 130 for your LDL. That's low density lipoprotein. That's what it means. That's considered to be, quote, the bad cholesterol. It's the kind of carrier molecule that will deposit cholesterol into the vessels. And so you want your LDL low. Less than 130 would be, by the laboratory, okay. Ideal will be closer to 100. If you look at HDL, which is the high-density lipoprotein, the values usually, they want them, it used to be above 40, now you can see it's up above 46. The HDL is that moiety that helps transport cholesterol and to remove it from the body through the liver, through the bile and so forth. Bile salts are largely cholesterol salts. And so if you have a high HDL, it's thought to be protective against a lot of atherosclerotic disease. And so you'd like to have your HDL high. Now, we have recently come to find out that we used to just say, well, high cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, you're okay. But now we have identified a subset of HDL cholesterol which is not so healthy, and you can find people with very, very high HDL levels that we are concerned about because certain subsets may not be very healthy. If you have a very high HDL, the total cholesterol may be elevated because of the HDL. And we used to say, well, that's okay because all of it's HDL or most of it's HDL. But now we're starting to recognize that that's not just an inviolable rule, that there can be subsets of HDL that are not as healthy. Okay, any questions about the lipid panel? Okay, let's move on. It's another blood fat that's contributed to not so much by the ingestion of just fats, but you'll see it in people that take in too many calories, they're obese, they're overweight, they're taking in too many sweets. Oh, the question was about triglycerides. What might contribute to high triglycerides? Well, you can inherit a certain genetic predisposition to make more of these. And there... Sure. Okay? All right. Yes, ma'am. Did you have a question? No. Okay. All right. Yeah, there are, we call them the dyslipidemias. That's what it's called, where you inherit certain genetic predisposition to make cholesterol, triglycerides, a combination of things, and those people are usually at much greater risk to have coronary disease and atherosclerosis. But we're not going into that today. We're just trying to help you understand the laboratory data. All right, let's move on to the comprehensive metabolic panel, which gives you a screen of certain substances that are normally found in the blood. And if we'll start, there is the glucose. That's the blood sugar. You see that. And they'll have the reference range. Now, usually that reference range for glucose is fasting. In other words, usually an overnight fast, and then they'll take it in the morning. And if your blood sugar is above the 99 level, then you are thought to have impaired glucose handling up to about 125, and then above that, it's called diabetes. Okay? So if your fasting blood sugar on more than a couple of occasions is greater than 125, we refer to it as diabetes. Between 99 and 126 is impaired carbohydrate tolerance, pre-diabetic, if you want to call it that. Okay, the next two, the urea nitrogen. It's called blood urea nitrogen, BUN. And then creatinine, there it's 0.73. The creatinine and the blood urea nitrogen are substances that are in the blood. They result from the breakdown of certain proteins, and the kidney normally filters these. But if there is a problem with, let's say, kidney function, or let's say that there is a shrunken vascular volume because, let's say, the person is taking diuretic medications or whatever, and so the filtration pressures going into the kidneys are not as great and you can't filter as much, those levels will start to rise. So the BUN and creatinine are often looked at as representative of kidney function. It doesn't matter so much if they're low, but if they're high, you've got some problem there. Dehydration, like I said, shrinking the vascular volume, can also cause the BUN to go up. Creatinine also, but not proportionately. The normal ratio between the BUN and creatinine is somewhere around 10 to 1. BUN to creatinine, 10 to 1. That's a fairly normal ratio. And it is in there, you see. Now, you'll come to the eGFR, which is estimated glomerular filtration. It's a big word. The glomerulus in the kidney is just that collection of capillaries where the blood is brought, and then the filtration takes place where there is an exchange of the blood substances that are going to be excreted. They are removed, and it comes in contact with the renal tubule, the kidney tubule, and so through the mechanism, it's very complicated physiologically. Truly, we are wonderfully and marvelously and fearfully made, right? But there's an exchange so that those substances that are going to be excreted from the blood will be passed over into the kidney tubule, the nephron, and then excreted in the urine. Well, the glomerulus are these little capillary tufts where all of this is taking place, and if the glomerular filtration rate is low, kidney function is usually impaired. So you might be able to find normal BUN and creatinine early on in kidney disease, but the glomerular filtration may be impaired. It's a more sensitive indicator. And you'll see that they list it for a non-African American or an African American. There seems to be some difference there. And they'll usually print it out, and you look at that as to whether it applies to you. Are you an African American or a non-African American? So again, it's a reflector of kidney function. After that, you can see the BUN and creatinine ratio, and you remember they give you up to about 22, but the average figure is around 10. Now let's move on to sodium, potassium, chloride, and carbon dioxide. Those are normally put together and referred to as the serum electrolytes, our blood electrolytes, salt, sodium, chloride, potassium, and carbon dioxide. Things change in the blood with different disease processes. If a person becomes acidotic or alkalotic for some reason, you'll see fluctuations in these, like in the CO2 level. If a person, let's say, develops different disease states, they may have changes in their sodium and chloride concentration. If we're giving people diuretic medication that's causing salt to be excreted with chloride, you may drop the serum sodium and the chloride. People sometimes that go into fluid overload states may dilute the sodium down, so they have hyponatremia. That's what it's called, low serum sodium. So that's what those are. Those are the blood electrolytes. Then you get total serum protein, and then the albumin, which is another carrier fraction. Many substances are carried by albumin, which is a carrier molecule. It's usually produced in the liver. The globulin portion, you'll see, is where we find a lot of the immune globulins. You've heard of, like, the gamma globulins. You know, if people are given injections to try to boost the immune system. And there are several classes of the immunoglobulins. There's IgG, IgA, IgM, IgE. But anyway, they're proteins, and they're a subclass of this. So the two classes under protein is your albumin and your globulin fraction. And that's where they're categorizing this. Low levels of serum albumin and protein can be found in states where there is disease and the person is not able to eat very well. They're cachectic, they're malnourished. Protein levels and albumin will drop. If you get certain inflammatory disease states where the immune system is activated, you may see a rise in serum proteins, and especially the globulin fraction, because of inflammatory responses that are going on. And then below that, you'll see total bilirubin, alkaline phosphatase, AST and ALT. This reflects liver function. Total bilirubin, alkaline phos, AST and ALT. Now, the total bilirubin may be elevated in some individuals in the fasting state, and this is referred to as Jobert's syndrome, spelled Gilbert, G-I-L-B-E-R-T, a Frenchman whose name is applied to this. He first, I guess, observed it. But it simply means that there is a sluggish enzyme system in the liver for conjugating breakdown products of red blood cells. That's all it is. If all the other tests are normal, the bilirubin is a little bit elevated, we're not too concerned about that. But if there is an elevation of your alkaline phosphatase enzyme or the AST-ALT, that is more reflective of some problems that have affected the liver. Alkaline phosphatase is normally found in those cells that line the bile ducts and ductules. The AST and the ALT are enzymes that are found more in what is called the liver parenchymal cells, the substance of the liver that does certain things, that makes certain things, and so forth. Hepatitis, you'll get a rise primarily in the AST and ALT. They usually go up very high, some elevation of alkaline phos. But if you begin to get biliary obstruction for any reason of the bile ducts, the alkaline phosphatase will go very high. Urinalysis, let's move to that. They'll usually give you a color of the urine and whether or not it is turbid or cloudy or clear. And then they'll give you a specific gravity. The normal specific gravity, where the urine is neither concentrated nor diluted, is 1.010, 1010. If you're concentrating your urine, then the values will be above 1010. If you're diluting your urine, the value will be below 1010. Now, for most people that are healthy and are drinking a fair amount of water, your urine should be very pale and clear, right? Because you're putting out a lot of fluid. Even though you're excreting impurities, the kidneys are able to do that in a larger volume of fluid. Have you ever noticed, though, how, let's say, if you've had a long day, let's say you've been outside, you've sweated, you haven't gone to the bathroom very much, you haven't drunk much water, what color is your urine? Very concentrated, like a deep yellow or dark. And that is not the best. You want your urine to be pale, very dilute. That's right. Okay, so then you go on down, and now we are looking at the pH. A lot of people look at that and they want to say, oh, well, the body's acid or it's alkaline or whatever. No, the body will adjust and keep the blood pH almost to tenths of a point within about 7.4. But it does it by changing the pH of the urine and how much carbon dioxide the person is exhaling in the breath. And there's some other buffering systems, but those are the two main, the kidneys and the lungs. Average, you can see there, 5 to 8. 8 is up more in the alkaline, and 5 and below is more acidic. Now, there is, when they do a urinalysis, they do a dipstick. They take the urine, it's in a little cup, and they just put a little stick that's been impregnated with certain squares. And they stick the little dipstick in it and hold it up to a chart, and they're looking at it. And it's a color chart. And you have various things. You have glucose, bilirubin, ketones, which is another byproduct of fat metabolism. So if you're fasting for a long time, you're going to start burning fat, and the ketones will be positive. Occult blood, if there's any blood in the urine, any protein in the urine. Nitrites is a chemical substance that it becomes positive if there's usually bacteria in the urine. Leukocyte esterase, it just tells you, are there inflammatory white blood cells that are picked up there? And then they count them, white cells, WBCs, RBCs. Squamous epithelial cells are seen mostly in ladies because the urethra opens there right at the vaginal vestibule. And so you can get just desquamated, normal lining cells in the urine, and those are called squamous epithelial cells. If you get that, you probably have a contaminated urine. Because you want a clean catch and a midstream usually. So they'll have, it's easier for a male, just the anatomy is different, but for a female it's more easy to get contamination from the vaginal tract. So we usually will ask ladies especially, but also men, to make sure that before we collect the specimen we do hygienic cleansing of the perineum. And then we ask them to go ahead and start to urinate, and then while they are urinating in midstream, collect the sample, so it's not a start or a stop sample, it's right in the middle, and then we'll get the most reliable test results. Bacteria, whether there's any bacteria seen, and cast come from the kidneys usually. So let's go into the CBC. Stands for complete blood count. You have a white blood cell count, a red blood cell count. You have a hemoglobin and hematocrit. Now let's just talk about that for a minute. White blood cells are part of the immune system that God has put in our bodies to help us combat infection, inflammation, cancer, and so forth, right? The normal there is up to around 10,800 white cells. An average vegetarian, not a fishitarian, but a true vegetarian, is probably going to run in usually the low 4, occasionally high 3s, but mostly 4,000 to 5,000. Huh? I don't know. It's just the body, I guess, doesn't need as much because you're healthier. Yeah. Yeah. Now, when you start getting meat and so forth, and you're eating meat, because most of it is, you know, the animals are often sacrificed now, and it's not a pleasant experience, I'm sure, for the animals. And it's, you know, they're not killed easily. There is a stress involved with that, and they are dumping out probably a lot of the hormones into their bloodstream that we take in, cortisols and so forth. And cortisone does elevate the blood white cells, no question about it. And probably that's another reason. Plus we get into all the purines that are in the meats and so forth. It's a stimulating type of food, and the white cells are often higher in someone who is on a meat diet. If you get an acute infection, like a bacterial infection, the white blood cell count usually rises, and the type of white blood cells that are predominant, if you'll look down under the platelet count, you'll see neutrophils. It's just a type of white blood cell that usually responds in a bacterial infection. Now, in viral infections, in contrast to bacteria, you may see a little bit of rise in the white blood cell count, but you may have a normal white blood cell count or a depressed white blood cell count. And a lot of times you may see a predominance not of neutrophils, but of lymphocytes. In certain hematologic blood-borne diseases, you can get abnormalities in these white cell ratios. We call them lymphoproliferative disorders like lymphocytic leukemia, lymphomas, and so forth. The lymphocyte count may be elevated, and the total number of lymphs. So anytime, even if we see somebody with just a minimally elevated white count, but if the lymphocytes predominate, it's a red flag, because normally your neutrophils are to be in the predominance over your lymphocytes, normally. So this could be the precursor of some lymphoproliferative disorders if the lymphocyte count is higher than the neutrophil count. We're all familiar with hemoglobin and hematocrit, I think. You know, this is what reflects anemia. Hemoglobin is that portion of the red blood cell. It contains a protein fraction and an iron fraction, the heme portion. That's why they call it hemoglobin. Globin is the protein. And basically that is the part in the red blood cell that carries the oxygen. If you have low hemoglobin levels, it's usually a reflector of a low red cell count, and you're anemic. That's what we call it when you have a low level of hemoglobin. Hematocrit is just the ratio of the red blood cell mass to the liquid compartment of the blood, the fluid compartment. And both will usually go down in anemias. Usually the hematocrit is about 3 times what the hemoglobin is. That's a rough rule. So anytime you see a low hemoglobin in a hematocrit, the person is usually said to be anemic. Now, the MCV is the mean corpuscular volume, and it just has to do with the size of the red blood cell. As the red blood cell gets smaller and smaller and smaller, the MCV gets less and less and less. A larger red blood cell, the MCV will get larger and larger and larger. Now, the physician can look at that and tell how to categorize anemias. Most anemias that are associated with just disease states, chronic illness, they're normocytic. Normocytic, that means that the MCV is normal. If you would tend to have, let's say, iron deficiency, either in young ladies that are losing a lot of blood, you know, with the menstrual cycle every month, or in older people who are past reproductive age, you have to start worrying about blood loss from the colon or the bowel that can cause iron deficiency. Anything that will cause you to lose blood, the iron deficiency states come up. And so if the physician's looking at that, and let's say the hemoglobin's 10, and you've got let's say a person that is 35, having fairly normal periods, otherwise healthy, and a fair amount of blood loss with her periods, the first thing you think about is iron deficiency anemia, and you put that lady on iron. Have her increase her iron-containing foods and so forth. If the lady's 57 and she comes in, and she is, let's say, 7 years past menstrual bleeding, and she is anemic, and she's got an MCV of 65, the first thing you think, this lady has some occult problem in the bowel and she's losing blood. We've got to then investigate that, okay? So that MCV lets us know what types of anemia are most likely. Some of your inherited anemias, you've heard of thalassemia, you know, it's a type of inherited anemia. It produces a small red blood cell. You may even have a normal hemoglobin and a normal hematocrit, but the MCV is very small. Think of an inherited hemoglobin problem, and then we do a hemoglobin evaluation. If you start to get large red blood cells, so the MCV is going up and the total blood counts, hemoglobin and hematocrit, are going down, then we think about certain diseases such as B12 deficiency that causes these large red blood cells. We call them megaloblasts, and so we call it a megaloblastic anemia. Somebody that has had poor nutrition that can get folate deficient, it can also cause large red blood cells. And then there are certain lymphoproliferative disorders that cause a problem in the bone marrow with the maturation of the cells. These are usually pre-malignant or malignant. They can cause large red blood cells. The MCH is mean corpuscular volume, MCHC, mean corpuscular hemoglobin concentration. I'm sorry, MCH is mean corpuscular hemoglobin, and the other is mean corpuscular hemoglobin concentration. Those will usually go up and down as the MCV. It's all it is. It's what's in the red cell. Platelet counts. Platelets are those substances that float around in the blood cells that help the blood to clot. And you can get certain problems with low platelet counts, high platelet counts. You may see primary disorders where there is an overproduction of platelets because of a pre-malignant or malignant disorder. You may see platelet counts that are low for a variety of reasons. Certain infections, like somebody with hepatitis or chronic hepatitis, they may have low platelet counts. You can have certain autoimmune disorders where you are consuming platelets, destroying them. If you've ever heard of, it's called ITP, idiopathic thrombocytopenia. They're just different diseases, but that's what the platelets are. They're the substances that normally circulate in the bloodstream, and when they come to, let's say, like if you cut your skin, why don't you just keep losing blood? You got a rent in one of the capillaries. Why don't you just leak and leak and leak? No, God put these little platelets in there, and when they sense an irregularity in the lumen of any vessel, even the capillaries, those little platelets come there and they just stick. And as they aggregate there, they begin to form a plug, and then they release certain clotting factors that when the blood that's normally going through there, it activates those clotting mechanisms in the blood, and the blood starts to clot. Isn't that amazing? I tell you, this body is just phenomenal the way God made it. So that's the platelets. We talked about the different types of white blood cells, neutrophils, lymphocytes. I'm not going to get into monocytes, eosinophils, basophils, except to say this. RDW is a, where is that? Yeah, that is a red cell, what do they call it? It's another measurement of a dimension, and it has to do with mixed types of anemias. Like if you were to have a B12 deficiency and an iron deficiency state, it gives a clue because the RDW is elevated. It's just another one of these measurements, and I'm trying to think of what that RDW stands for. It's red cell something. We don't use it very much unless the person is anemic and we're trying to see what may be causing that. The eosinophils are there in increased concentrations if you have allergy states, if you have parasitic disease, or if you have primary eosinophilic infiltrative disease processes. And there are certain types of disease that can produce eosinophilia. Okay, the TSH down at the bottom is thyroid stimulating hormone level. You will see the reference there is 0.4 to 4.5. The thyroid stimulating hormone level comes out of the pituitary. It drives the thyroid. If the thyroid gland for some reason is not functioning well, and let's say it doesn't put out normal amounts of the hormones T4 and T3, then the brain senses that, and immediately the pituitary gland will release increasing amounts of stimulating hormone that will act upon that thyroid and try to stimulate that thyroid to produce more hormone. So one of the earliest signs of hypothyroidism is normal levels of thyroid hormone, but a rising TSH level. That's called subclinical hypothyroid. Now, it'll finally come to the point where the gland can't keep up enough with that driving thyroid stimulating level, and it will fall even though the high TSH level is there. So if you see a high TSH, let it be a clue to the possibility of a hypothyroid state either developing or present. 0.4 to 4.5. And then we come over to B12. It's just a measurement of that vitamin. Pretty straightforward, 200 to 1100, but you'll notice, well, they don't say it here, but if you can have clinical B12 deficiency states with levels probably up to 350, 400. And then we do another test if we think the person has B12 deficiency, but we measure the level and it's, let's say, 300. We will do another test called MMA, methylmalonic acid, and it will be high if there is a cellular level, a cellular condition of B12 deficiency, even though serum levels may be as high as up into the 300s. And the final one down there is vitamin D. You'll see the reference range being 20 to 100. I think we have already discussed that. Yes?
What's the indication of a high B12 level?
Most of the time it is, oh yes. What is the indication of a high B12 level? People taking supplemental B12. That's the most common cause of that. Occasionally you can see liver disorders because B12 is stored in the liver, and if there is any condition that is injuring the liver, causing a dumpage of B12, you can see it there also. But most of the time, if you get a high B12, people are taking too much. And you know, how much do you need a day of B12? About 6 micrograms, isn't it? Well, some people vary in their estimation, but it's minuscule compared to what we're measuring here. And we are now supplementing people with doses that are really mega doses of B12. You know, you're taking 1,000 micrograms a day. You ever, I mean, that's not uncommon for people to do that. And you know, you don't need but just a few. Now, if you're B12 deficient and you're having trouble absorbing them, then higher doses is reasonable. And then sometimes we can't even give it orally. We have to give it by injection if you can't absorb it. But anyway, let's go to vitamin D quickly to finish. You've heard the lecture on vitamin D, and you'll know that most of the medical people in this country do not agree with the current standard laboratory reference ranges for health. Now, some laboratories are changing their reference range, and I anticipate you're going to see this pretty quickly, where the references are going to be up into.
Yes, keep going. I'm just saying that is one.
Oh. Oh, the urinalysis, okay. Or SED rate, is that SED rate? Yeah, okay. So anyway, it is felt by most of the medical experts that you need a minimum D level over 30, 32. Minimum. Ideally, more up into the 40 to 50 range to promote good, healthy states. The sedimentation rate on the next page is, you'll sometimes see it listed on a printout like this as ESR, erythrocyte sedimentation rate. It's a very simple test. You take blood and you put it in a column, a little tube that you stand up, and you watch how fast that column of blood sediments in 1 hour. And you read how many, it's just millimeters, how much it falls in 1 hour. There are certain physiologic changes that occur in the blood with inflammatory disease states. We don't want to have to go into all of that and why it happens or whatever. But the blood, if you can just remember this, the blood will fall faster when there is inflammation in the body, cancer, you know, infectious diseases. And so anytime we see a high sedimentation rate, it doesn't tell us what is wrong, but it tells us something's wrong. And it alerts the clinician to start looking for other problems, okay? Even though we might not expect it. Like, for instance, with, let's say, somebody with lupus, and they come in and you don't know they have lupus. Their joint hurts. And so we'll run a quick SED rate. If that SED rate's 10, they don't have lupus. We're not worried so much about that. If that SED rate comes back and it's 55, something's wrong. And then we have to go ahead and explore that a little further. Up to about 20.
And it's 0 to 20 for women, and I think based on the some women, we have 0 to 15.
For men. Okay, 0 to 15. All right, I think we're told our time is out. So we're going to stop here, and then if you have questions afterwards and you want to ask them, I will, but we need to cut at this point. So, I appreciate so much your attention, and we'll end at this time.